Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Are you fond of riddles? Regardless of whether the answer is yes or no, allow me to tell you one, taken from Game of Thrones. The scenario is that a king, a priest, and a rich man stand in a room with a common sellsword or mercenary in their midst. A conflict is then introduced into this situation. Each of the three powerful men commands the sellsword to kill the other two. The question is, who lives and who dies? If you've never heard this riddle before, take a moment to pause and perhaps post in the comments as to who you think holds the power in this scenario. Is it the king? Is it the rich man who can pay the sellsword to do as he wishes? Is it the priest who can compel the sellsword by virtue of appealing to his immortal soul? Or is it actually none of these individuals? Because the point of this riddle is that power lies where people believe it to lie. For as long as animals have been gathering in groups, there have been questions about who is the most powerful individual within said group, and quite who holds that power. How is that power exerted? Is it the individual who has the most powerful potential who holds the most power? Or the person who wields that power most effectively? And what about those who can influence the most powerful? All of these questions have dogged historians for centuries and will do for centuries more. Ordinarily, we speak about power in its, inverted commas, hard and soft forms. But since when did power come with a mattress firmness rating? Is it not true that power is simply power? And whether you're whispering behind the ear of the individual who wields the sword, or whether you are the person wielding the weapon, is it really the case that power in its most obvious forms are where the greatest amounts of power lie? The reason that I put this riddle to you is that for far too long we have always said that it's the men who wield the most power in the Napoleonic era and indeed for the majority of history. But is that necessarily the case? Is it not true that soft power can simply be described as power, and that the distinction is often limited in terms of the gender of the individual who wields it? For Wellington was most certainly a whisperer behind the throne, but we describe him as a powerful man. But to speak of Josephine as being powerful is much more likely to elicit a caustic response. Tonight, we ask the question, who was the most powerful woman during the Napoleonic era? And in the process, we're going to deconstruct the notion of power and hopefully use the word power slightly less than I have done during this opening monologue. In order to unpick this, we have assembled the Napoleonic Wars Pod Brain Trust with a very special guest who I will introduce last of all, because you always leave the best until last. This is not to imply that my first guest is the least valuable individual in the room, because it is Dr. Beau Memory Reynolds, scholar in residence. We can't call you Lord High Commissioner of Napoleonic History because that's Alex Mikaberidze. So shall we call you sort of Grand Marshal of Napoleonic History? Will that do for you this time around?
I'm fine with that. Comes with a suitable amount of lace.
Always kind of focusing on the important things in life, such as the suave sophistication and the uniform that you can garner in the process. Next up, an individual who's not unused to a quality uniform, our redcoat in residence, Liam Telfer Esquire, quartermaster of the pod. I can't elevate you in terms of titles really, other than to call you, I don't know, Regimental Sergeant Major of the Nap Wars Pod. Is that acceptable to you? Oh, you don't look happy with that suggestion.
It's not really a thing at the time when you think about the regimental system, but I would take Redcoat in residence. It sort of keeps an air of mystique, slightly sort of Scarlet Pimpernelli, and I'm down with that. So yeah, Redcoat in residence will do me nicely, sir. Thank you very much.
Liam Telfer, the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Napoleonic Wars Pod. That needs to go on a hoodie immediately. Next up, we have Louis McLaughlin, our social media whiz, undergraduate at, I want to say Glasgow. I really should know where you're doing your undergrad studies. Oh, I got that wrong. Not at Glasgow. Where are you based, Louis? Apologies. I know I should know that.
Strathclyde. So,
okay.
Correct city, wrong uni.
Okay, well, apologies. No aspersions intended. And last, but by no means least, the Stadtholder S of Napoleonic history, Professor Beatrice de Graaf from the University of Utrecht. Beatrice, it's a joy to have you back. Frankly, it's been far too long. How are you doing?
It is. I've been missing you a lot, guys, so I'm very happy to be back tonight.
So before we get the show on the road, I want to get your thoughts in terms of that opening monologue, not in terms of the quality, because the quality or lack thereof certainly speaks for itself. So we'll put that discussion to one side, thank you. But in terms of the riddle, I suppose, first of all, but also your thoughts on hard power, inverted commas, and soft power, and this debate about whether or not women wielded, inverted commas, proper power during this period. I'm sure we all have thoughts. I've said plenty enough already. Beatrice, it would be rude not to come to you, first of all, on this, as our honoured guest. Take it away.
Yes, thank you so much, Zach. I'm very happy that you brought up this question of power and the soft and the hard power. And power's obviously always very much a relational thing. So it's the power of the one person vis-a-vis or in relation to the other one. And then hard power sort of suggests that there is an absolute and very precise relationship where the other one has to give in institutionally, hierarchically framed, for example. But with women, it's completely different. So to jump already into the discussion a little bit, but just lift the tip of the curtain, the woman that I will be addressing is one of which the Tsar of Russia said, "It's a pity that she wears skirts. She would have made an excellent diplomat." So being a diplomat, being with a specific rank, being a count or a prince would give you hard power. But on the other side, with the skirts on, which is necessarily a soft power thing, I think Alexander totally underestimated this person, because with the skirts, she was not just a whisper, she was behind the throne, she was behind almost every chair of every important person in the room, which gave her quite a lot of influence. So you could say that soft power is perhaps even more pervasive, and it's very important to you cannot properly define it, but it's very important to look for it in historical records.
See, I sometimes wonder if the girls have been quite content for the boys, inverted commas, to go, oh, we wield the power because we have hard power and we're waving swords in people's faces, whilst they sort of quietly go, yeah, all right, hun, but actually I'm the one who can influence you quietly over dinner. So if you want to think that you're the one making all of the decisions and actually I'm the one prodding you in the right direction, that's fine by me. But that's a discussion that we can perhaps take to the comments. Liam, you're somebody who would traditionally be described as wielding hard power, given your career in the British Army. But equally, we've spoken in the past on this show about your daughter and her ability to influence you quite emphatically and decisively. So therefore, you have experienced both the hard and the soft in terms of power. What are your thoughts in terms of what's most effective?
It's a great question. I like to do as I'm told. I will inflict the hard power in the direction in which I have been directed to wield it. I think the sort of whisperer behind the throne mentality is so valid, particularly in this period and with some of the people we're going to talk about tonight. And it is surprising when you start diving into this how many of these so-called great men of history are massively influenced. And some of these are huge decisions that are being led by the person they're sharing their bed with. Not some sort of grand strategy or some keen intelligence, but purely on an agenda from somewhere else. So I think although there is that hard power, soft power dynamic, they're sort of intrinsically linked in the sense that hard power is just being wielded by someone by suggestion. So yeah, I think it's a really, really cool thing to dive into.
Well, hopefully the listeners will agree. Louis, hard power, soft power, or is there such a thing as medium power? Or should we just ditch this whole kind of very bizarre firmness rating sort of, it's almost kind of reminiscent of, how do you like your steak done? Do you like your power rare, medium rare, or mooing? Talk me through your thoughts on this distinction of power.
I think it goes back to that what Beatrice said. It's this idea of one's not larger than the other. One, they're perhaps different, and perhaps we think of hard power, that's more noticeable. But when you look at soft power, it can be more eroding in a sense. It can be over a longer period of time. It can shape thought over time. So perhaps the hard power is just the face of the soft power doing its work. So I think they're intrinsically linked. So it'll be interesting to see the dynamic. And I think with a lot of the women we've picked tonight, they sort of permeate and jump across between both spheres.
I mean, at the heart of this, of course, is the question of Napoleon and who influences Napoleon. And one of the things that struck me as I was sort of thinking about where this conversation might go tonight is the fact that if you take Napoleon out of the equation, suddenly the question of who is the most powerful individual in Napoleonic France is wide open to a very serious debate that completely ignores gender. Because at the top of the tree, you have people like Josephine and Marie-Louise, and equally you have people like Fouché and Talleyrand, who can turn around and influence Napoleon in different kinds of ways. And then you've got his brother marshals as well as his more competent commanders. So there are so many questions about who actually has the most influence if you just remove that focal point of power. Luke, when it comes to memory history, I'm curious about where discussions of power go, because in the one sense, with your work on memory, the focal point perhaps isn't so much on who has the most power as the trickle down of the events that are precipitated by, inverted commas, powerful individuals. But as I say that, at the same time, I'm thinking of the very powerful counter-argument, which is that if power lies where people think it lies, then the propaganda machine has the potential to go into overdrive. So where does power sit within your realm?
With money is the honest answer. It sits where people will spend money to go see it. It sits where people think is the correct answer. The propaganda machine does spin up, but what it does come down to a lot of the time is simply bums on seats. What I will say is that, first of all, I thoroughly enjoy the very Carry-On-esque back and forth of soft power versus hard power that has been the past 20 minutes of this podcast. And the answer to your original question, Zach, is the sellsword. The sellsword has the power. The sellsword has the sword in that small room. And war is the continuation of policy by other means. So they do bleed into each other. It depends on the situation. It depends on where you're going. But in the form of memory, it really is who controls the narrative, who spends the money. And this is the thing. It really does shift, right? So if we look at, for example, London in, say, 1824, you have a lot of men saying this is how this was represented. This is the correct answer. You have a lot of men putting those shows on. But you have a lot of mothers deciding where they're going to take their kids to witness this for the family holidays, and thus influencing which version of Waterloo is going to be remembered by an entire another generation of Britons.
I mean, it's a very different set of scenarios to that question of which movie are we going to go and see at half term, kids, isn't it? I'm not sure sort of the fights between different cinematic studios have quite the same level of significance in terms of popular memory of historical events these days. I do find it telling as well that Luke answers the question in the same way that Tyrion Lannister does in Game of Thrones when it comes to that riddle. Whether or not that means that Luke seeks to position himself as the Tyrion Lannister of the Napoleonic Wars pod is a question that we shall leave for another day. But we shall dive into pitches at this point. Usual story, 5 minutes. And for today, then the 5-minute rule will remain intact because I'm not doing a pitch. Partly because I'm sulking ever so slightly because someone nabbed my choice and I'm not brave enough to fight them. And if you're watching the video version of this over on Spotify or indeed YouTube, you'll know exactly who that individual is because they're laughing their head off at exactly that thought. We are going to start strongly, I suspect, with Dr. Memory.
First of all, Zach, let's be clear about this. You're not brave enough to fight anyone on this podcast. And I include Beatrice at the top of that because not even Liam is brave enough to fight Beatrice, and I'm certainly not. I would tier that as probably Beatrice, Liam, and then probably me and Louis at about equal, depending on how you want to put it. There's sort of the Scott scrappiness versus 6'2" and built like a brick shithouse, and then Zach very much at the bottom.
You say that, but I do have the mute button at my disposal. So therefore, am I truly where the power lies in terms of control of information on this show? Let's park that, and the listeners can, discuss that in the comments. But far away.
All right. So my story begins actually much like Beatrice's does, with Tsar Alexander I, to one extent or another. During his, Tsar Alexander, as we all know, or hopefully all know, was raised in the sort of fine Enlightenment traditions. But the Napoleonic Wars wore those down to the point where he was having a crisis of conscience or a crisis of faith as the wars came to an end. And into that gap stepped Baroness de Krudener. To give her full name, which I'm not going to pronounce the whole thing because I will butcher it, but Barbara von Krudener, to give her the immediate small name. Granddaughter of a celebrated Russian field marshal, strict Lutheran, but crucially a Lutheran theologist and Baltic German mystic who sought a meeting with Alexander I and finally had that meeting when he was basically in his religious cups, clutching his forehead, reading his Bible, trying to figure out what to do with his life, and came in at exactly the right moment. Whether she timed it or not is a debate for the ages, but is largely responsible for shaping Alexander I's foreign policy, religious policy, for the tail end of the Napoleonic Wars into the peace, and is generally considered to be the true, or one of the true architects of the Holy Alliance. The alliance that would fundamentally be one half of the forces that shaped Europe in the 19th century coming out of the Napoleonic Wars. An alliance that was born, as Beatrice has said on this very podcast, out of Napoleon's return, which gave us the Treaty of Paris, which gave the Treaty of Vienna, or the Congress of Vienna, its teeth, and allowed it to go from being just a normal, regular, we've been at war for 20 years, now we're going to be at peace for 5 years, then we're going to be at war for 10 years, then we're going to be at peace for 5 years, et cetera, the traditional foreign policy of Europe, turned it into something that actually endured one way or another for for a century, 99 years, if you want to be really technical about it. So this is a woman who, at the time, her power was very clearly understood. Suddenly, her religious salons in Paris became one of the places to be seen because she was in power, and therefore other people wanted to be there. And then, in her own private life, not through the traditional use, as far as we know, of a tour de faire or skirts or bed sheets or pinning reminders to make commissions to bed sheets, shaped European foreign policy in a way that few others have. It's really that simple.
The pitch ended far sooner than I expected, if I'm honest. Well done for sticking to your time limit.
Someone has to respect the time limit on this podcast.
And you're that individual, are you? Let's park the banter for another time. This is the classic interpretation of power resides where people think it resides, right? And that is why, well, perhaps you disagree with this, but I do wonder if part of the reason that people react so vociferously to situations like the Mary Ann Clark scandal is this idea that, oh dear, we've got women influencing things like who's getting a say in who's getting a commission. Now, was that a scandal in the sense that she was being paid? Yes, but equally there was a scandal in the whole British commission system anyway, which was people were buying their rank in the first place, and she was just facilitating and exploiting that.
Correct.
So I am curious about any backlashes that she experiences. You build a very positive picture. I'm not going to sort of sit here and pretend that she doesn't have power, but I am curious about your thoughts on where this stacks up across the spectrum. So I get the feeling that a lot of this is built on the fact of the successful outcome of the Napoleonic Wars, which you can partially attribute, yes, to the influence on Tsar Alexander, but there are also a myriad of other situations and factors that result in that successful outcome. Other nations themselves, their own rulers, influenced by other individuals, both in front of and behind the throne. So I'm curious about your sense of pushback that she receives at the time, and also the security of her position in terms of how deep-rooted that power is.
Well, first of all, I mean, your points are well made, Zach, and I will address them, but I would argue that every single pitch we're making here is dependent on the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars. So in the influence stakes, there is a lot of push. There's a lot of back and forth, right? On one side, there is the whole sort of religion, mysticism, which is, at the risk of sounding truly horrific, considered more traditional women's work in many ways than, say, the diplomatic salons of Vienna are, right? And going back to, it's a shame that she wears skirts. No one is going to blink on that one, but there is absolutely that sort of, hang on, why is this man listening to her? What's going on here? Why is this woman dictating policy? But in that case, I think it's fundamentally less because she's a woman and more because in this way she's almost a bit of an outsider. I'm pretty sure that if her, one of her male counterparts had gotten his hooks into Alexander in the same way, the same objections would have occurred. It's of that sort of, wait a second, what's going on here? Especially in a country that was moving very quickly back and forth between sort of Enlightenment tradition and hardcore orthodoxy. This sort of Lutheran Swiss Reformed Church and Moravian Church is a little bit of an outside force, right? The bishops are delighted to find Alexander finding God again in a more traditional way. They're less delighted when it doesn't come steeped in the traditions of orthodoxy. And I think that would apply one way or the other. In terms of the stability, you're right. She is not married to him. It's very easy for him and thus everyone else to walk away from her if he desires it, right? This is not a matter for state divorce. This is not a matter a la sort of Josephine and divorce there, or Queen Charlotte and that whole insanity there, on the British side. But in a way, that means that she's also not limited by her formal power in that way. She can whisper however she wants.
I mean, you've raised Queen Charlotte. There's a rabbit hole to explore. The woman who is selected because she's not going to be too vocal and poke her nose in how King George III runs his country, and then ends up having to be regent for a time because of the king's illness. There's a fascinating dynamic. We did an episode, I believe, on Queen Charlotte that folks should go back and have a listen to.
We should do another one, in fairness.
We could, and perhaps we will. I could waffle at length. I am very curious about how easy it is to influence Tsar Alexander, particularly given what happens to his father. I think that's perhaps a discussion better left to more qualified people than myself to speak to. Louis, let me turn to you for the moment. What are your thoughts on this pitch?
That was a point that came into my head. You mentioned the character of Tsar Alexander. You wouldn't exactly say it's groundbreaking to sort of convince him, given his character. But I'm just more thinking about this idea of how, when you're saying she's influencing all this policy, like how far down the road are you going to go in you're talking about in terms of like influencing like the wider like Napoleonic history. So I'd just like to maybe get your wider thoughts on that, Luke.
Yes, Tsar Alexander I is easily manipulable in certain ways, is easily influenceable in certain ways. That doesn't stop the people from doing it from being important. And she does it extremely well. In terms of long-term policy, yes, you can take that several different ways. Does she outside of the Holy Alliance, does she influence foreign policy? Does she influence policy in a wider European context? It depends on if you believe the rumors that she's one of the people whispering to him to spare Napoleon. And there is no... I haven't done a deep enough dive into her to say this definitively, but certainly in my research for this, I have not found enough to say that one way or another, which is one of the reasons why it wasn't in my overarching pitch. But there certainly are rumors about it, and sort of, Alexander is one of the voices that fundamentally helps to decide Napoleon's fate twice in many, many ways. But there's also the question of, sort of sheer volume of people. Alexander is in control, authoritarian control, of the largest population in Europe. Fundamentally, at that point, depending on how much of Russia you define as being in Europe, and that's an entirely different debate. So there is, I think, influence there, even if it doesn't extend outside of her brief time in Paris to the salons of Paris or to the salons of Berlin or Vienna or London.
Liam, let me get your thoughts.
Saving your best guns for last, Zach?
I mean, if we're going to build up to that point where you're issued with a devastating salvo that leaves you speechless, in the style of Alex Mukaberidze, then surely we have to leave Beatrice till last.
I would argue that Alex leaves people speechless in the style of Beatrice de Graaf.
Yes. Look, you can get your compliments in now in the hope that she softens the blows, but Beatrice is always delightful but exacting, and you know it. Liam.
I do.
Well, I thought it was a great pitch, Luke, to be honest with you. I think that kind of whispering influence is exactly what we're talking about, and I'm not sure whether that's within the podcast sphere that we're talking about now or within the Napoleonic Wars. Interesting food for thought. I'll hand over to Beatrice and she can add something of value.
Well, thank you, Liam, for leaving the hard power to me to wield. Well, there was one very specific concrete element that totally supports Luke's claim to raise up the expectations. And that's a very hard evidence piece that I'm wondering why you didn't include it, Luke. Because when the Baroness of Crudena came into Paris with her daughter, the Tsar allowed her to hire a palace directly next to his, where he lived. And he made it possible that there was a direct door in between the wall of her salons to his quarters. So every evening she went through, or he went through to hers, and they had a session, a séance, you could say it, a prayer meeting, where everyone and people of high rank and standing came in. The secret officials came in, the officials came in, ministers came in, and they prayed under the guidance of Tsar Alexander and the Baroness of Crudena for the health and the well-being and the heal of Europe. So in that particular moment in time, I think Luke is spot on. She may have had the largest share of spiritual power. I think that's the way to phrase it. Mm-hmm. And she was totally effective. But then, and this is where I think her power immediately was aborted, the spiritual, the soft, the social, everything, because on the 26th of September, when the Tsar published the Treaty of the Holy Alliance, she did not stay behind the throne as the spiritual whisperer. She came out and she told everyone that it was her making, and she had composed the first draft, and she had put it to Alexander, and he had just undersigned it and went out with it. And this was such an amount of indiscretion. It's so not fitting for soft power that Alexander, when he left, a couple of days after concluding this treaty, it's in a chapter in my book, by the way, if you want to read about it. So I really found the French secret archives and the intelligence, the Allied Intelligence Service archives, where they were also reporting about it, because there were also spies present at those seances. And then she had to leave Paris after Alexander, and he did not allow her to follow him home. So she lingered on. She stayed in Württemberg and many other places. And in the end, I think it was 1820. So 5 years after, she came into St. Petersburg again. And then the Tsar forbid her to speak to him again. So I think she had this moment in time where she wielded tremendously metaphysical, spiritual power, and she was the powerful force in the making of this Holy Alliance, which totally did what Luke said it did. But then I think she totally overstepped her boundaries, and just the door literally was closed between her and the Tsar. So it was a very short moment in time, but a very intense one. I think this props your argument up, Luke.
I would agree, and I think really what probably happened, yes, I did not include that particular detail about the doorways, although it is valid, mainly because I have a problem with a lot of not your book, Beatrice, but some of the others that have immediately leapt on that and gone, well, that means they were sleeping together, which I have a massive problem with. So hence why I didn't lean into that. Because there is power non-sexually.
No, exactly. That's not what I meant. Totally side with you here. Yeah.
Yeah, no. I know that's not what you meant. I honestly, Krudener popped into my head because I was thinking of your book. That's how we got on this tangent to begin with. But I think the truly telling part about how she does mess it up is that in a way, whether she says the soft part out loud or just begins to really believe her own propaganda, she is taken in by it as well. And that is what levels that indiscretion at her and fundamentally is slapped down, because whether she forgets the egos of the people she's working with or simply forgets the fact that that women are limited to soft power in this moment, and they're not allowed to step out from behind the throne. That is what costs her everything, or not everything. Like, it's not like she's hounded into obscurity to the same level. She's not exiled or hunted down or dies in penury, but it does cost her her ear.
So once again, we return to this idea that actually women can control the power so long as the men don't realize that they are having power wielded over them, which I suspect may become a bit of a common theme over the course of this episode, sort of male responses to the fact that, oh dear, we're being influenced. There we thought in our sort of macho world that we were the ones being powerful, and now it turns out that maybe we're not. Which I think is perhaps a lesson as old as time itself. Next up, we are going to Louis. Who have you picked as your most powerful woman of the Napoleonic era?
Thank you, Zach. Now, if anyone tuned in to our last episode we were talking about which nation was most responsible for Napoleon's defeat, I came down hard on the Prussians for them that didn't listen. I essentially robbed them of 1813. But I'm going to try and win the support of our German listeners over, and I'm going for Queen Louise of Prussia. So the first bit I want to touch on is a role in Prussian politics. Now, it goes without saying that Frederick William III was quite timid and known for his chronic indecision, and it's Louise that fills that void. She accompanies him on numerous state visits, particularly to see Tsar Alexander in 1802, in 1809, and of course, most importantly, Tilsit in 1807. Now, I can't say I've done a deep dive on Queen Louise, but from what I've read on her, she acts as both a comforting wife and also a formidable partner, because she had strong governmental connections with, of course, von Steen and von Hardenberg, who dominated Prussian policy for that period. And a good insight into that is in 1806, when Prussia was in its reform crisis. Von Steen drafts this piece of writing encouraging the king to reform and whatnot. He actually consults the Queen first, and I think what's quite remarkable is she doesn't act very reactionary to it. She doesn't slate him for criticising her husband, but she actually agrees with the points he's making, but just suggests doing it another way. So it's this idea of although it's her husband, she's politically astute too, and also at the same time she's in that interplay between obviously the king and his ministers. So influencing policy, political intrigue, dialogue, etc. And we see this again in terms of foreign policy when she opposed her husband's stance in war with France in 1806. And even when we look further, when she encouraged the king to reappoint Stein in 1807. So here we see her being directly involved in the hiring and firing, I suppose, of Prussian ministers. But I think what shows our power in terms of what we would call the hard power is in Tilsit. Now, we know it doesn't go successfully, but I want to paint the situation like this. Prussia's been humiliated at war with the battles of Vienna and Auerstadt. She's now been humiliated at peace in terms of Tilsit. I know to say there'd been a third wheel at Tilsit has probably been generous. And in a last bit attempt to try and encourage Napoleon not to come down on Prussia so harshly, what does Frederick William do? He sends his wife. Now, it was unsuccessful, as I've said, but to go into a room and essentially diplomatically beg the de facto master of Europe showed clearly that both she had some mettle and the king clearly buyed that into her. Now, Napoleon obviously wasn't convinced, but from what I've read, she clearly played on his mind and then, criticised her quite heavily in a lot of the Grand Army bulletins. So she's infiltrating the sort of mindset of not just the Prussians, but also the other leaders of France too. And whilst I'm on that, it's important to mention Alexander. When she had a deep connection with him to the point that when she died, he actually brought about some sort of hard sanctions in Prussia to pay all these debts quite fastly and limiting troop size or whatnot. I can't remember it off the top of my head. So she's clearly got influence with the leaders of Europe at the time. But I want to look at it from another aspect as well. And I think she symbolises what you would see the changing perceptions of the Prussian monarchy. From 1793, she travels extensively with her husband throughout the Prussian lands and was highly approved of by her subjects. And she also done a lot of charity work, which again brought ordinary Prussians closer to the royal family. And many stated that the nature she was quite relatable and easy to understand and get along with. And this saw public perceptions towards a monarchy change. And I think it's Christopher Clark that makes this good point that Louise is at the forefront of this shift from an underwhelming passive queens of the 18th century in Prussia to this idea of not just it's this idea of the Prussian king and the Prussian monarchy, but it's a royal family and dynasty, which again will have effects further down the line. So I want to picture it like this. It's in a highly patriarchal, militarised society. There's this young, beautiful woman who is at the forefront of the Prussian state. She's well turned out, and quite a fashion icon. She's a good mother and often seen in reality and, of course, in painting with her children. And she also makes efforts to connect with her subjects. And it's clear why many subjects were sucked in. And it goes to this idea she's got power above and also below. Additionally, though, I want to look at the legacy she's left. Firstly, of course, she was a true symbol of German strength and freedom during the occupation period and even getting into the War of the Sixth Coalition. And even, we go back to what I was saying about she was influencing the heads of state. Tsar Alexander was actually on record of saying that the French caused her death and that war with France was the only way to avenge it. And again, we see that her husband, Frederick William, finally grows a bit of backbone and joins the Sixth Coalition in 1813 and initiates the War of Liberation. So again, we're seeing her ideas and her thoughts, influencing her husband further down the line. Now, we've also got in 1814, what happens? You have the Order of Louise, and this rewards Prussian women from all sectors of society for service to the state, and it also evokes this idea of strong Prussian and German femininity. Lastly, of course, she had many kids, and one of them would become king, of course, Frederick William IV, and would be king of Prussia, but most notably, of course, is one of her other sons, and that's Wilhelm I, who became the first emperor of a united Germany. And it actually came into my head just there that, for the 100 years of the 19th century, you had her husband was ruled for the first 40 years. Then the next 21 years was one of her sons, and then the last 27 years was one of her other sons. So for 88 years, clearly get strong influence. And I think it's not wrong to say that how her upbringing and her kids and what she sort of the values she establishes in them doesn't rub off on them and shapes them even as they get into adulthood. But I'm going to conclude. So Queen Louise of Prussia was a beacon at this juncture of Prussian and Napoleonic history, and I think in terms of her power, it permeates through numerous facets. You've obviously got the leading role that she played and tried to reinvigorate a tired state in the midst of growing geopolitical tension. But you've also got the power elsewhere, in that she changed public perception of the Prussian monarchy and provided a figure for ordinary Prussians to look to and rally around. And again, you've got this idea of the power perhaps outlasting herself. What's her only weakness? I think it's just the fact that she died only 34, and you're always left to wonder how she would have featured if she was alive, going into the war of the Sixth Coalition and, Napoleon's eventual defeat. But in just over a decade of involvement, her beauty, courage, and ability to lead and captivate enshrined her name into one of, if not the most powerful women of the age.
It's a valiant pitch, Louis. I make a habit on this show of being the mean guy to you. Shall I continue with that tradition, or shall I strike out anew? Josephine, I think, is the Achilles heel of this argument, in the sense that there are a couple of things that you're pointing to that do cut away the idea that Josephine is the Achilles heel, not least sort of the legacy building and the fact that Josephine isn't able to have children with Napoleon is what it eventually ends up toppling her. Nothing else realistically would have done. But a lot of what you're saying is stuff that Josephine does, except that I would argue that Josephine does it potentially better. So from a fashion perspective, Josephine's legacy is utterly enduring. I don't want to sort of, if I say too much, I'll be stealing part of Liam's pitch. So I need to be careful in terms of how much I say. There's a lot of what you're saying here that Josephine also does. And so if you put the two women up against each other, I'm just not sure that what you're saying kind of triumphs.
That is really unfair, Zach, to be fair. Like, you're sort of putting him on a spot there. I've got a bit of a question for you, Louis.
Yeah.
And I'll agree with, your own admission there that I haven't deep dived into this woman, and she sounds remarkable, and I'm sure Beatrice and Luke will be able to come back with something way more powerful than I have. But a question for you is, how much do you think of her sort of reputation and the sort of power and influence that you've talked about has been amplified since her early death? She sort of gets almost turned into some sort of Prussian saint, like a soul of Prussian virtue, and kind of amplified, especially as we go into sort of these German nationalism and all these sort of Prussian movements come to the fore later in the 19th century. And I don't know how much of her kind of reputation as the sort of the heart of Prussian virtue has been amplified by that.
I wouldn't go as far to say she's the sort of heart of Prussian virtue, but I think what's important as well is, when you get in 1813, 14, it's not a case of generational, collective memory and this idea of sort of glorification, because it's people that known her and, connected with her. And I think it's this idea you've got to build these relationships and this character up in order for these things to happen. And I think what you're saying perhaps is, it could be true of a lot of historical characters at the time, but I think what you're saying is definitely she becomes a symbol of Prussian virtue. That's undoubtable. But I think it perhaps takes away from how much she done when she was alive, and it plays into this idea of mysticism. I think it actually takes away from it.
I'm going to help Louis here, not just because he's named Louis after Queen Louise, so it's very fitting. I think he's spot on. Louise is really perhaps the heart of continental resistance against Napoleon. And we already have the Russians, but even without Tsar Alexander and the Emperor of Austria and Prussia on board, she was the one orchestrating already in 1805. So I'm going to bring in some hard facts, not just soft power, hard facts. She was the one who forged the powers together and created the Potsdam Treaty in 1805. And then again, she became in 1806 the symbol of resistance. And when they were crushed by Napoleon, she went in 1808 to raise and instill in her sons, Frederick William IV, the later one. And they didn't know that there would be a kingdom of Prussia to reign with properly, but still, she sort of raised her sons, Frederick William and William I, the later one, as true heirs to the Prussian heritage. She supported reform to make it possible, and her husband really was very hesitant. And Napoleon once famously said, "There's only one real man in Germany, and that's Louise." And it's true. I mean, after her death, we don't hear much of the king at all anymore. So she really was the throbbing heart behind the resistance, and not just the resistance in Germany, but also the resistance of the subsequent alliances. And she did so with charm, and even Napoleon was highly impressed about her. So I think that's the main difference with Josephine. And I'm not going to steal your thunder, Liam, and it's more like a question, but for me, Louise is a very much a political figure, and she was. Napoleon also said that, and when she died, he said Frederick just lost his only one true minister, and he was right in that. She was more like a general in skirts. So, and that's, I would say, a completely different role than Josephine had, with all the charm and the fashion involved. So, and just again, you rightfully said so, Louis. But being a mother myself, this woman was 34, and she had, how many children did she have? 8 children. It's that alone in itself, 8 children, and she remained very pretty and charming and agile, and she died of a fever in the end, but she was so overwhelmingly beautiful and intelligent. And sorry, now I'm making your pitch for you, but I'm totally side with you here. I've stopped now.
Thanks very much, Beatrice. I've actually got one of the quotes here about beauty. I think it's Kanye said, "I would have given one of my years to stay with her as long as the Emperor did." So there's it. That's it in concrete. But I'm not going to shut your question, Dr. White. I'm going to bite back at you. Beatrice has gave me time. She's fought a delaying act for me. I'm going to come back, and again, I think it's this idea that Napoleon's competent, whereas Frederick William less so, and it places more emphasis on Louise. And I'm not taking it away from Josephine's competency. I think she's very astute in how she goes about, her business. But she definitely plays more of the. And I think I think Napoleon and Josephine, it's this idea of Emperor and Empress, whereas because of Frederick William's drawbacks, I think Louise has to fill that vacuum. And I think there's even a letter she wrote to him. She said something like, "Oh, you need to have more confidence." So she clearly feels she has to step in to make up for his misgivings. Whereas I don't think Napoleon and Josephine, that ever has to happen. Apart from, of course, when Napoleon's on campaign. So there you have. I think it's 2 different scenarios you've got.
That is very nicely put, because you are quite right. Josephine doesn't really have a vacuum to operate into. She has to carve out her space, and that is particularly challenging when you are married to the pin-up of all misogynistic prigs. Not my words, Beatrice's. And so with that in mind, you are absolutely right. That is the challenge that Josephine faces. She can't choose the forms of power necessarily that she would want, because she's having to deal with such a domineering, narcissistic, controlling individual as Napoleon. So that's I was kind of hoping that you were going to reach for that kind of difference in terms of how they operate. So I can't counter argue with you on that, Louis. I think it's a very well put point. Luke?
I mean, I have to salute Louis and to a certain extent Beatrice by making a virtue out of just how weak Frederick William III was in certain ways, to put it nicely. I take Beatrice's point very strongly, and it is a very valid one. And she is sort of this, this icon of Central European royalty, never mind womanhood, full-on royalty. But I also do take Liam's point that, sort of her early death, allows her to... There's a quote in one of the British Reform newspapers when Wellington goes against the Great Reform Act that basically says, it's on Waterloo Day, and it says, if he had had the courtesy to die at the moment of victory at Waterloo, much like Nelson had at Trafalgar, the laurels of glory would have bloomed evergreen on his tomb. But because he lived, he managed to mess it all up by voting against reform. And I do get a little bit of that with Louise. She was incredible, and yes, the best minister that Prussia had, Prussia's first minister, and yes, does go to Tilsit and does sort of push her people and does push those secret alliances, but a lot of this is also her memory, and that memory was forged after her death at the height of her power. The Order of Louise was not founded until 1814. Arguably one of her most lasting legacies is the Queen Louise League, and that's the 1920s. It is the aftermath more than anything else. It's a good pitch, Louis, or it's a good pitch, Beatrice and Louis. But worth our time, worth our respect, absolutely. I'm not sure how she stacks up to the others.
I think what you're saying about, when I get back to the Order of Louise, I think you've got to consider the fact that sort of geopolitical, Prussia's under occupation for, much of that sort of 1807 to, essentially the Battle of Leipzig. So there's more pressing matters than to start creating medals. But again, it gets back to what I'm saying. I said to Liam, I think it's this idea of it perhaps takes away how good she actually was by surrounding her in sort of this mystique and German fantasy. But you've also got to look at why was she created? She's put herself out there. She obviously she clearly had a good relationship with the Prussian, in terms of Prussian state and the Prussian people, in order for them to buy it. Because if people hadn't heard of her, would they have bought it? I think it's a valid point. It's definitely been amplified after her death, but the sort of foundations of that are because she was excellent in her life. So it's more, I think both things are true at the same time.
All right. So from one valiant pitch to a pitch that perhaps is going to get an easier ride because it's certainly the most obvious answer to the question. Liam, are you about to blow us all out the water?
Absolutely not. You've had two sort of very good and sort of academically founded pitches there. And what I'm going to do is be the comedic light relief before we get Beatrice come in and show us all how it's done. So my pitch, as we've alluded to, clearly is going to be Josephine de Beauharnais. And I just want to start off with a really simple question. You started with the question, Zach, so here we go. When we picture power during the Napoleonic Wars, what do we see? Generally, it's armies, marching across Europe, it's artillery, it's cavalry charges, it's borders moving. And the person at the center of all of that, clearly, is the man that gave the age its name, Napoleon Bonaparte. But as we've said, power in history isn't always the person holding the sword or indeed the big stick. Sometimes it's the person who makes everyone willing to live under it. So, and if we're going to judge influence that way, then one of the most consequential figures of the era wasn't a ruler, she wasn't a minister, she wasn't a general, she wasn't on battlefields, but it was Josephine de Beauharnais. Not because she ruled France, but because she made Napoleon's rule acceptable and palatable. Now, Napoleon had many problems back in the 1790s. He had his military brilliance, but no legitimacy. He's a Corsican officer from sort of seemingly minor family in a country that's just executed its king. France is on the edge of going either way. And Europe, wider Europe, that is, really fear revolution. Then he married Josephine. So she's this socially established, politically connected, politically savvy, completely fluent in society. And through her, Napoleon enters the salons where reputation matters more than rank or even sort of battlefield acumen. Napoleon himself, writing in early in the marriage, admitted her unique social power. She has grace beyond any woman I have known. She translated him into Paris, so to speak. So when he seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire, he didn't appear as this unknown general, but as a man already absorbed somewhat, at least, into political society. She didn't necessarily put him into office, but she made his office survivable. And then as Empress, although, she has now we talked about the sort of hard power, she didn't necessarily hold this hard power. She's not signing huge treaties or planning campaigns, but she's performing the function every regime desperately needs. She's softening the power, like we said. At court, she's welcoming former revolutionaries and old nobles alike. Petitioners will come to her for mercy because she's approachable in a system that's built around hierarchy and meritocracy. I think it's one of her ladies in waiting said that everyone sought her protection. No one feared approaching her. And this sort of reconciliation of all parties is what gives Josephine almost the ultimate soft power within France. It's not ceremonial influence, it's regime stabilization. Napoleon, through his actions, is enforcing obedience, but she's now reducing resistance. So, Europe still spoke at the time. Obviously, we're still talking a Europe that's full of the ancien regime. It's monarchy, it's ceremony, it's hierarchy, it's dynasty. Napoleon had all of this victory, but victory, as he knew, didn't make a dynasty. Josephine helped supply what the conquest couldn't. She had 2 kids already, right? They married into, the Bonaparte line for one, and then Eugene married into Bavarian royalty. Now, yes, this is potentially under sort of Napoleon's political military pressure. But what it's also doing is it's sending a message of legitimacy to all the other sort of big houses in Europe. So these old monarchies are, starting to treat Napoleon's system as at least permanent enough to marry into. And if, observers at the time say the emperor governs by power and the empress by persuasion, surely that's the ultimate form of power behind the throne. In this sort of ancient regime, Europe, persuasion could achieve what victory couldn't. And that all along, like I've said, is acceptance. Foreign visitors met her before they trusted France. Families sought pardons through her. Courtiers negotiated access through her. She became this human face of a military empire. Diplomats recorded her manners, accomplished politically what the war couldn't, because the stability, as we know, depends far less on fear than on predictability. Josephine made people believe that life under his regime was livable. Now, we mentioned earlier about the divorce in order to secure an heir, and I like you said, Zach, I think without the fact that they didn't have kids, there was no need to have that divorce. If she'd been merely a decorative bauble as part of Napoleon's empire, her importance may have ended there. Perhaps not necessarily in the fashion world, but in terms of her sort of soft power influence, it probably would have ended there. But she remained respected across Europe, and even by some of the people that were enemies of France after Napoleon's fall in 1814. We know the stories of Tsar Alexander visiting her at Malmaison and the impression that she had on him. The conqueror of France in certain circles trusted the former empress, not as a ruler, not necessarily even as a negotiator, but as a figure safe enough to bridge enemies and build bridges on. So even without a crown, she's remaining a stabilizing influence and politically reassuring. So what was Josephine's real power? Like I said, she turned authority into legitimacy. Napoleon made Europe submit, and Josephine helped Europe accept. And that acceptance determines whether power endures or collapses into some sort of endless resistance. Now, to just wrap this up real quick, at the end of his life, Napoleon has reportedly said that the things he valued most: France, the army, Josephine, not territory, not crowns, but a person. She'd performed a political role no minister could. She made his rule human. Napoleon built an entire empire through force. Josephine made it socially possible, which is why her influence wasn't necessarily visible on battlefields, but visible in the fact that the empire functioned throughout when it did. And that is a very different kind of power. It's not necessarily the power that commands history, but allows history to happen. She was the person that made Napoleon possible. Thank you.
And Mr. Telfer takes a bow. This was the pitch that I sort of went away and sulked at the fact that I didn't nab this one first. But you've seen Liam, you've seen me. Who's going to win that fight? We all know that's only happening with one outcome. But let's be real, it wouldn't be the first time that two dudes have had a fight over Josephine. Quite frankly, I think you could go even further with this pitch. The example that I always use that demonstrates that Josephine wasn't just somebody who whispered behind thrones, but actually could grab leaders by the scruff of the neck and play them, is that moment before the coronation in December 1804, when she is acutely aware of how fragile her position is becoming because she hasn't married Napoleon. They've become their families have been joined in a civil ceremony as opposed to a church marriage, and so it's much easier for Napoleon to divorce her. So she goes to the Pope, who's in town for the coronation, waits and picks the moment perfectly to the night before the coronation, and then confesses in floods of tears to the Pope that she's terribly concerned for her immortal soul because the royal couple, the imperial couple, haven't been married before God, and what would happen if she were to die and go to meet her maker and not have that union sanctified in God. The royal couple have been living in sin. This weighs terribly heavily on her heart. And of course, the Pope loses it, storms around to Napoleon's gaff, technical term, refuses to take part in the coronation ceremony the next day. And the reason he's in town is because Napoleon needs that kind of image of legitimacy from the Pope looking on. And so he has no choice. He has to acquiesce. Josephine knows the men she is playing and absolutely utilizes it and plays it perfectly. She knows the space that she can and can't operate within. She knows where those limits are. She doesn't overstep those limits, but she absolutely gets what she wants. And she decides her own future. That is power in its truest sense in a relationship where she doesn't get the opportunity to flex muscles in anything like the way that Napoleon does. Now, having made a sort of subsidiary supportive pitch in favor of Mr. Telfer and Josephine, I now need to ask a mealy-mouthed question, which is somewhat difficult, given that I've just sort of championed you. I'm struggling, so therefore I'm going to pass the baton over to somebody else and make it somebody else's problem. Beatrice, what is the counter-argument to Josephine, or isn't there one?
Well, there's one additional argument, Eva. I mean, she's the mother of our first queen. So I can't go very easily go against this argument at all. I mean, Hortense de Beauharnais, who lived here in Utrecht, and Josephine with the mother. So who wouldn't adore that woman? That said, I think there's one particular argument to make against the plea. It's about what the scope and the end goal of the power is. And actually, you said it yourself, Zach. So what was the aim? What was the remit of Josephine's power? Was it to make France bow to Napoleon, or was it to get into his good book? So was it to get what she wanted? So she wielded that power for her very own, I wouldn't say selfish. I'm not against any woman fighting for her own position in life, but it's very much personal power wielded for her own family and her own remit and for her love for Napoleon. Does that really count as political, as social, cultural power? I think it does. I think all of what you said is true, Liam. But what was her real aim in life? I think that's much more narrow than, for example, the aim of Louise was.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think sort of by proxy, she is trying to protect hers and her own. She's, like Zach said, she's trying to legitimize herself and Napoleon's stepkids, right? Like, you don't kind of want to be on the wrong side of Napoleon Bonaparte if you're the stepkid that he doesn't really want. So by placing them in, royal houses of Europe, whether that be the Netherlands or whether that be Bavaria, it not only does it protect them, but it also legitimizes them and gives them a future. Now, I think you're probably right that her initial scope and aim is probably quite narrow, but eventually the ripples in the pond spread out. And by sort of looking after her own and looking after herself, it ends up having quite substantial, influence and power throughout Europe.
There's also a challenge here, isn't there, that her monumental Achilles heel, as we've discussed already, is the lack of children. You look at how the situation changes for Marie-Louise when she bears Napoleon a child. Suddenly her position is, from my understanding, elevated quite substantially, and she is able to act in a much more sort of regent-esque role when Napoleon is away on campaign. Now, you put Josephine in that scenario, and I think suddenly Josephine becomes an incredibly potent, perhaps actually quite dangerous mix to Napoleon and Napoleonic power, because she's got the guile to think and maneuver Napoleon, who is somebody who's quite hard to maneuver, and yet would also have that legitimacy of, the heir to the imperial throne. Sorry, I've gone and made a supporting side pitch. Luke, repair this damage of what I'm doing, which is basically sort of cheering Josephine, which isn't something I'll apologize for, but nonetheless doesn't make for great podcasting.
Can we get away from the notion that the only thing that makes a woman great or not is the product of her womb, please? Yes, I thoroughly enjoy Liam's pitch. I will say, this is me, so her influence on fashion is all important, but that's just my own bias. But yeah, mostly I do object to this whole sort of, the Achilles heel is her lack of children for Napoleon. God, what a horrific statement to make.
But if I may, this is we have to view her power through the degree of power that Napoleon is willing to give her, and Napoleon's view on the most significant woman in history is the one who had the most children. So it's not as though the issue from our perspective sitting here in 2026 is, she didn't have kids with Napoleon. It's that Napoleon inherently limited her, the degree of influence he was willing to give her, because she wasn't having kids for him.
Yes, but at the same time, I'm dubious of the fact that if you give her the child that he eventually gets from his second wife, he's willing to give her the level of regency and power that he's willing to give his second wife, combined with what he knows about her level of ability already. Napoleon doesn't like threats. And, one of the... As you just said, right? You give her... She gives him a child. And as you put it, she's the only one that can rival him in a weird way. He's not going to like that. He's not going to accept that. He'll take the child. Absolutely. That's what he wants. But there comes a point where he's going to smack her down. Knowing Napoleon, possibly physically.
I'm waiting for you, Zach, because you started this. You pulled the pin on this grenade. I've got another couple of points that are unrelated to this, but I'll quite happily... it looks like we're sort of dual wielding this pitch now.
So it would seem. Just as well that we're not going to go with my honourable mention this afternoon. I do take the point. Yes, she becomes a danger. However, Napoleon needs to control France above all things. We've discussed this endlessly in terms of who can he trust. With Josephine, he's well aware that he can trust Josephine. So much time is spent talking about, Josephine wasn't faithful, she wasn't loyal to Napoleon. She has one affair. How many affairs does Napoleon have? Let's just pause and accept that.
No. I'm sorry, Zach. You cannot have this both ways. You cannot say...
I haven't finished my point. Shut up.
You cannot... No, you cannot dismiss my point by saying we're looking at this from the period of the time and then come back with your point saying the exact opposite thing.
That was a side rabbit hole. That was a segue.
All right.
Let me come back to my point and finish what I'm saying. So Josephine is often described as not being loyal to Napoleon because of this initial affair that she has. And everybody then ignores the fact that Napoleon is grossly and very visibly unfaithful to Josephine. Side point, just pointing out the hypocrisy there. But Josephine is well aware, especially as Napoleon's power builds, and particularly as the Bonapartist clan circles baying for her blood because they hate her, that her power is inherently linked to the degree to which she stays in Napoleon's good books. Josephine is an exceptionally intelligent human being. And so she has this is somebody who knows which buttons to push and when to push them. So I do take the point that yes, she has the potential to outbloom Napoleon in terms of her power and her popularity, but she also has the savviness to recognize that she can't do that. So she carves her own niche, prioritizing her newborn, as she did with her two children through Alexandra de Beauharnais. Josephine's story is fundamentally her doing the absolute best she can by her kids before anything else. And so therefore you add a different king of Rome, if you will, or a queen of Rome into the mix, and Josephine will play that very delicate game, making her indisputably second only to Napoleon, therefore safeguarding her own kids, but not rivaling the emperor, because, as you say, that would be incredibly dangerous.
I think it's worth just adding here that, Napoleon gives her a lot of power by virtue of the sort of pedestal that he puts her on. She's seen in society as this like lucky star, this icon of the age, and she has to sustain that, right? It's smoke and mirrors to a certain degree. She's seen, what happens when things go wrong. She's been in prison, she's seen the terror. And like you said, she needs to do right by her kids. So in order to maintain that, dare I say, facade, it requires, like you say, it's knowing which button to push and most importantly, how hard you can push it before it starts pushing back.
Louis, do you want to enter this fray as well, or have we scared you away?
I'm going to go for it. No, listen, I thought a quartermaster gave a really good pitch, and I did like, you actually beat me to it, Liam. I did like this emphasis you put on of a sort of pre-Napoleon career, and that's what I do find quite. That's what I find about Josephine quite interesting is now, like my example, like Queen Louise, she gets elevated in that position firstly through birthright and then secondly through marriage, whereas Josephine, it's different. She engineers her way to the top. And I think when we talk about Napoleon's rise to power, from army man to emperor in 11 years, Josephine's rise to power is, I think, equally phenomenal. And I also like that idea was playing into my head, right? Napoleon's winning the battlefield. And listen, you think he's away from France a lot of the time, and it's Josephine doing a lot of that sort of management for him. So no, I thought the sort of main 2 points I was having a think of, you hit the nail on the head with them.
So it sounds like all hail Josephine, to rob a line from Jurassic Park, and a poem that I now can't remember because I'm nowhere near as cultured as I should be. Luke will probably know. Where's the whole all hail Josephine line from?
As you said, Jurassic Park, that well-known epic poem of the 19th century.
Which is a very nice way of covering the fact that clearly you don't know either. So
I don't. I will freely admit that I don't know that one off the top of my head either.
So whilst we go and consult Professor Google, we will fill that void with the moment that you've all been waiting for, folks. Beatrice, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so very much, all of you. I have to admit, this is such a great episode, and I can fall in love with each and every woman that you're now describing. And I think it's so important to raise the power dimensions that all of them wielded in their time. But I'm going to bring in someone, given the perspective of the Napoleonic Wars, could perhaps count as the one pivot that helped to bring the coalition together that decided the Napoleonic Wars, the Sixth Coalition. And what do I mean with that? I'm hinting at the person who was the one. Liam brought up the term palatable, making a male ruler palatable to his people. Well, this particular woman made a whole country palatable to another country. And if you bear in mind that the two countries, and we're talking about Britain and we're talking about Russia, that they were not on the best terms before the Napoleonic Wars. There was, of course, the continental blockade, 1807 to 1812, but before that, there were already different competitions and crushings between the two of them over the Caucasus and over Asia. So they were not on the best of terms, and they did not completely trust each other. So on the eve of Napoleon invading Russia, the Tsar sent one of his best, I would say, woman, but he had to send the man, and then the woman went along to Britain, the epicenter of where the coalitions with their monies were forged, to London. And it's the person of Dorothea von Lieven, to be more precise, Katharina Alexandra Dorothea von Lieven, née Benkendorf. And later she became the Princess of Lieven. And she was perhaps one of the most illustrious and most inspiring and most well-connected woman of the age. And I'm not discussing here the fact that she had liaisons and also love affairs with, not just with Metternich, to just name one, but also with the Prime Minister George Canning, and some say even with the Duke of Wellington himself. So she literally brought all the main players together, I would almost say in her bed, but that's not the decent thing to say. But she did that nevertheless. Not all at the same time, obviously. Don't laugh, Liam. Well, and furthermore, it's not just that she brought the countries together and that she brought the coalition together. She also brought all those other persons around her together who were in the habit of influencing their men. I'm going to give a quote. It's Harriet Grenville, also a friend of the Duke of Wellington, and she had, I think, perhaps the best quote that defines the power that Dorothea von Lieven had. And Harriet Grenville says of this woman, she always has the best of an entourage. She always can keep off the bores. She has the courage to crush them. And, most importantly, the pleasantest woman in all society, in my opinion, always go constantly to her. So, and it's not just because she was the patroness of the place to be in London, the Almack's Assembly Rooms in King Street, St. James's, London, where she was the hostess, but she literally was the one, the pivot around everyone flocked. And this is not just a social call. This is not just to spread the latest news on fashion and the latest gossip on lovers, etc. But she was a dissemination pool of hardcore, hard power intelligence facts. So she literally served as the liaison to the Tsar, to Russia. As the Tsar said himself, I made that quote in the beginning, it's a pity that she wears skirts. She would have been the best of diplomats, but she was nevertheless. So I think when she came into London in 1812, and within no time, she was the hostess of this Almack's room. She brought the leading ladies together. She influenced the men. She had a lot of them in her rooms, literally speaking. And what she did, she really brought the alliance together, the Sixth Coalition. So Russia and England, Britain, and then all the other powers as well. And she convinced the Russians that they had to stop with the continental blockade and really now had to align with Britain. And they did, not just for the Sixth Coalition, also with the Seventh Coalition. And then later on, but that's breaks the span of the Napoleonic Wars, she was again influential in raising support in Britain for assistance in the Greek War of Independence and making Britain from a growing isolationist, anti-interventionist country into once again a country that aligned with Russia, and even to the extent that the Duke of Wellington had to go there himself and had to oversee the matters and take them in his own hands. And by the way, the Duke of Wellington commissioned a portrait of himself by Sir Thomas Lawrence and donated it to Princess Lieven, also just to show it's always Wellington, and not just to give a little tobacco dose, but a whole picture of himself. It's not very modest thing to do, but she was happy with it. So I'm going to stop here. She was not just very influential, she was not just very charismatic, as other people has written as well, but I think she was perhaps the one who was, from a geopolitical perspective, and if you would think about a person like this today, who has the ears of both the Kremlin and Whitehall, but she was that woman. So I think she was the pivot in not just making Russia palatable, but making the 6th and the 7th coalition palatable in both London and in St. Petersburg.
So on the basis that I won't fight Liam for Josephine, I'm somewhat trepidatious about fighting Beatrice over Dorothea von Lieven. I guess my question, however, is the sort of question that you might expect from Luke, which is sort of legacy and memory. To what extent is there a von Lieven legacy, a style, a way of doing things, or an acknowledgement of her significance that enables us to sort of identify this was her moment and this was her power in a way that you perhaps don't see with figures like Josephine, like with Louise, pictures as well with Louise. I'm not sure that's necessarily an Achilles heel to the argument so much as just a lack of awareness. But is that a problem in terms of assessing the degree to which she had power?
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, there are far little statues and memories and paintings of her because she was not a queen. She was made a princess later on, but she was not of a royal dynasty. She did not rule somewhere. And there is not a legacy in the sense that there is a duchy left somewhere or a smaller country left somewhere where she is being memorized and where she's being cherished as a national treasure. Yet, the whole theme that we are discussing tonight, question of women and women power, female power in foreign politics, that is where Dorothea Lieven has left an indelible mark on the discussion. So any discussion on 19th century or early 19th century international relations cannot omit her in that picture. So if you portray the diplomatic scenes, if you portray female diplomats, if you take into account the role of females in international relations, you have to start with her. And not just because, as I said, she was the leading hostess of a salon, but she also was very adept in wielding the networks of intelligence. So she was kind of Mata Hari perhaps goes too far, and that's too condescending to her, but she had held all the bits and pieces of information in her hands, and she was a veritable pool of information. And I think what's the legacy of that? Well, the legacy of that is not in plain sight. It's not there in, as I said, in paintings or in statues or in national commemorations, but it's there in all the annals of the coalitions and the decision makings and the wheeling and dealings behind the throne. So I don't think it will vanish at some point. It's still there. Is that a question, an answer to your question about the legacy?
It absolutely is. I mean, you're very kind to say it was a good question. It wasn't a good question, but you answered it admirably nonetheless. Louis, we're going to go to you next.
Really, really nice to listen to what you say. And what I find interesting, I think it's similar to, I suppose, Josephine early on, and Luke's pitch. It's this idea of they're not tied. You know, my example looked at things sort of dynastically in a royal sense, but this is, in terms of the diplomatic history, it's a bit, it's more interesting in this idea that it's definitely hard, power, but it's not in a sort of public sphere. People don't see it. So I like this idea of, like what you're saying about von Lieven, like working in the background, and like that to where she got to. She's not, she's not married into the, she's not married to one of like the heads of state. She's not, born into it. So I like this idea that if you're looking at sort of the voices you don't hear, we know the kings, the queens, the generals, but it's these people in the background that I do find quite interesting. So, and again, it links back to a previous ep on who defeated Napoleonic France. I think we came to this consensus that it was a sort of definitely Russia, but a strong British influence as well. And what you said there about the policy, I think, it really plays into that idea that, she perhaps set the events in motion for what would become, the war of the 6th and 7th coalition. So yeah, really lovely to listen to you.
Dr. Memory, you're sitting there with fingers steepled. Are you about to enter associate professorial mode?
Only in that the job of an associate professor is to back the full professor to the hilt. 1783. Russia goes to war against the Khanate of the Crimea and the Ottoman Turks. It takes the Crimea, and it sets in motion a new foreign policy of Russia that requires a dominance of the Eastern Mediterranean in order to truly feel safe and secure. Simultaneously, it enters into a Cold War with Great Britain, because Great Britain also requires domination of the Eastern Mediterranean and the sea routes and land routes to India to feel secure. As Louis has mentioned, the two powers fundamentally that we came down to it, that broke Napoleon, that won the Napoleonic Wars, are Russia on the land power side and the manpower side, and Britain on the economics and sea power side. And it's von Lieven, fundamentally, who puts them together, who allows them to work together, who, at least temporarily, diffuses that Cold War, that first, or arguably not even first, but that 19th century Cold War in the Eastern Mediterranean, and lets those work together. And at the same time, does it well, completely dominating the London social sphere through Almax. Almax is something that some of our listeners may not be familiar with. I'm hoping to fix that at some point, because there's actually never been an academic history of Almax written, and I want to write that book. But it is the dominant sphere. This is an institution that had enough power that they successfully at one point banned the Duke of Wellington because he refused to wear breeches. And they had the social power to say to the conqueror of Europe's conqueror, to quote the newspapers, "No, you're not allowed in here unless you dress properly." That is an enormous amount of social clout. And for von Lieven to rule that roost, while also, as Beatrice says, slowly but surely collecting the great men of Europe, and wrapping them around her little finger or legs, however you want to put it, is unparalleled and unprecedented. But in all honesty, no, it comes down to the fact that she diffused a Cold War. She diffused a Cold War long enough for two powers to work together to bring down an emperor.
I love you, Luke, for that great addition to that. Thank you so much. And just to add a little bit more details, later on, then her brother became the head of the Russian secret police. Her eldest son was appointed as ambassador to the United States, and her husband became the tutor of Alexander II. And then when she had all her relatives in place, she went away, and that's perhaps the thing that I love her most for. She just left a whole bunch of relatives and tsars and intelligence officials in Russia, and she went to Paris, and she led her later senior life and the love of her life, and that was the French Prime Minister Guizot. So they never married, but they lived together, and she died there. So that was the way she ended her life. I think it's very romantic.
Yeah. I will also point out that, we're talking about the aftermaths and Beatrice sort of skated over this, but bringing Britain into bear on the Greek War of Independence and the Greek movement of independence, once again, requires Britain and Russia to work together and to carve aside their differences. That's not to dismiss the Greeks fighting for 10, 15 years for their own independence, but Navarino really does, define that to the end and basically say, no, there's no way you can't win this at this point. And once again, that requires taking the two. And I think your point is well made. You're right. A foot in the Kremlin and a foot in Whitehall. But at this point, it's the equivalent of say the 1950s, the 1960s, a foot in the Kremlin and a foot in DC. These are the two great superpowers of their day, and to have them shaped, to have their foreign policy shaped by one woman twice, not once but twice, is unquestionable.
Yeah, and she had to start an affair with Lord Palmerston to get the British to do that.
A sacrifice that will not be unrecorded.
I'm trying to decide whether or not let's not assess Lord Palmerston as a romance figure. That's a podcast for another day, possibly a podcast for another podcast. Quite frankly,
maybe a note drops to betwixt the sheets for a dual episode.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide quite how much of a cross that is to bear, and I know about Palmerston's political character, but not much about his personal. So we'll park what that must have been like and the horrors she may have experienced in the process or otherwise. It's a great pitch. Apologies that we've now catastrophically lowered the tone at the end of this episode. Folks, a huge thank you as ever to my delightful guests. You've been listening to Liam Telfer, Louis McLaughlin, and Luke Reynolds from the Napoleonic Wars Pod, and of course Professor Beatrice de Graaf, the Stadtholderess, well, no, you don't like the term Empress, do you? Empress of Napoleonic history. That's too imperial and not to Beatrice's liking. But nonetheless, if you aren't familiar with Beatrice's works, obviously we will put the links in the description to this episode. But folks, you've been listening to the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. Got a question? Disagree with something we've said? Then post in the comments section and we'll get back to you. Remember to like and hit the follow button so that you never miss an episode. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in early February 2026, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Simon Weathers, John, Zach Johnson, Matthew Turner, Rich Payne, Edward Gilhead, Vic Martindale, Adam Coslin, Tessa Blaber, Nick Beckstrom, Stephen Walker, John Parkin, John Hennigan, Stephen Dicey, and The Bald Monk. The Admiral patrons: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, John and Casey Randolph, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, Rob Painter, JC Kaiser, Graham Swidenbag, Nikia Craig, The Iron Duke, and Plastic Tash. And in the Crown Yourself tier: Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell, Chosen Man Graham, Child of Wellington Brian Silcott, First Lord of the Treasury Ryan Diamond, Portray Prince of Pukalani Bob Burnham, General Alexander Suvorov Seth Hansen, and Too Jacobin to Crown Oneself Dan Hazelwood. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke and Louis, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.